Right along here, our next speaker is Doug Latimer. He'll be presenting WTF, My Beacon is Broken, an initial look at transceiver interference with search and rescue considerations. Doug is an author, a ski guide, forecaster, teacher, and lead guide for the Alpine Club of Canada. And Doug is sharing his research with Ivers Finvers, a PhD electrical engineer and ACC trip leader with the Calgary section. A quote I picked up is technology is a useful servant, but a dangerous master. And I know I've experienced my own WTF moments with my personally and with students with my own transceiver. I forgot to turn something off or something's too close. So I look forward to hearing your research on a practical approach to managing all this stuff. So, thanks, Doug.
Okay, great. Thank you. So just to check, are you seeing screen share, and is the audio coming through clearly?
You're all good to go, Doug.
Great, thank you. So yeah, a couple of years ago, I had a great pleasure of working with Ivers together on with an avalanche course. And it's always, I don't know what defining it for the rest of the industry, but there's always a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainty on how to address transceiver interference. The papers that are out there have been very sort of fairly scientific and haven't really been all that well focused on sort of practical applications. And so Ivers and I decided to try and figure out on just more of a practical level how interference is actually affecting avalanche transceivers. So it was almost a year ago now that we went out to the Banff airstrip, and we decided to set up a little test and actually see what kind of interference you can expect with avalanche transceivers. And more importantly is, how do we mitigate it? How significant is it? And are there ways to do searches if you are encountering interference? And so we spent the day working on this, and it was really a great pleasure because Ivers has a tremendous amount of experience dealing with electrical systems. He's worked in academia and also in the industry and been involved with a fair bit of this. So what we did is we chose an area that we could find absolutely no outside interference. There's no, as far as we could tell, any electrical power sources anywhere nearby. We measured out 20 meters. We laid the transmitter out on that little red pad. And then we set up a platform, and on that platform, we basically put a receiver, and we would put various devices at specific distances, 30 centimeters, 20 centimeters, 10 centimeters, and then in direct contact with the receiving beacon to see what kind of interference would occur with various devices. The transmitter was placed parallel, so the two antennas were pointing to each other to give us our strongest signal for one set of tests, and then we moved the antenna perpendicular, so we had basically the weakest signal as well, and we wanted to compare the differences. And what we discovered actually surprised me a bit, and there are a couple of things in there that surprised Ivers as well. So this is basically how we laid it out. The receiving unit was in the center, and then we had basically marked off 30, 20, 10, and in contact. And we would measure various electrical devices that we commonly had out there. So just to give you a quick rundown of what we looked at, just out of curiosity, Ivers brought a cordless drill, and the cordless drill was an incredibly powerful source of interference. Even 50 centimeters away from the receiver, it completely destroyed the receiver's ability to pick up any kind of signal. And so that might have some pretty significant impact for an industrial setting. If you're in an industrial setting and you're working with electric motors, if they are close to the receiver, they are probably going to create massive problems. So much to the point that, like I said, with the drill, at 50 centimeters, we were unable to do a search at all. Beyond the drill, though, we sort of extrapolated and thought about this. The magneto on a snowmobile works in a very similar manner to an electric drill and generates would also generate a tremendous amount of interference. And so if you had running snowmobiles nearby the searcher, or if the searcher attempted to do the search on a snowmobile, the magneto would probably prevent any kind of an effective search. We looked at electrically heated gloves, electric boot heaters. We used tablets. We used a 10-inch tablet with a display on, inReaches. We worked with an iPhone, headlamps, LED headlamps. We tried a GoPro. We used 2 different cameras, a very large Nikon 810, and then also a much smaller Olympus. They both had electronic displays. We used GPS. We used a VHF radio, the ICOM at 5 watts. And that sort of gave us a sense of what we can expect. And we also then tried it with foil, which I'll talk about separately. But these devices did things we didn't necessarily expect. Once the devices were more than 30 centimeters from the receiving unit at 20 meters, with the antennas basically aligned or parallel, we really didn't see any interference. And you can see that this is with a Barryvox. We tested this against a Barryvox unit, and things came pretty much straight across. There was no issues. When the antennas were perpendicular, there was a fair bit of variation, and the variation depended on the units. And down below here, what you're seeing is the numbers we saw on the displays. When we got interference, we would see basically the distance increase from what the unit read when there was no interference. And the more the signal increased, the more interference we assumed there was. So we were doing this basically inferring this, but essentially it showed us just how much it was messing up the beacon. And there's definitely a more profound interruption with electrical interference when the antennas are perpendicular to each other. So much so that by the time these units were within 10 centimeters, a lot of them prevented the unit from working at all. We lost signal entirely. And in contact, both parallel and perpendicular, it was pretty wide. But what surprised us might have been with the phones, because we've been hearing for years, put your phone in airplane mode, keep your phone on Bluetooth, or all these different stories, and none of that made any difference. What mattered with iPhones and with most of the electrical devices was the LCD display. If the display is on, it interferes with the transceiver. And the larger the display, the greater the interference. That was a pretty simple, straightforward result we found. The other thing we found was LED lights actually produce quite a bit of interference as well. So if you're wearing a headlamp, you're doing a search at night, or in poor light conditions, if the headlamp is close to your unit, it can actually have a fairly powerful impact. If you're using more powerful LED lights nearby, that might also have an impact. But so long as if you had a headlamp and the searcher was keeping the transceiver more than about 30 centimeters from the unit, it didn't seem to make much difference. And so that was a very positive thing we noticed. While they were significant, distance was a real asset. So electric motors were the worst. LCD display screens were the second worst. And then the electrically heated gloves were not that bad at a distance. But of course, you've got the transceiver in your hand, you turn the glove on. At 20 meters, it caused a loss of signal, regardless of the orientation of the antenna. So electrically heated gloves are bad. They're just pretty much flat out. If you're in contact, if you turn the gloves off, we didn't notice any issues. And if you're close to the victim, the signal is strong enough that they do work. This wasn't part of our study, but I later noticed someone had electric gloves, and at 7 or 8 meters, they could do a search without any issues. But once we got farther back than that, the interference from the gloves overwhelmed the signal strength that the beacon could pick up, and gloves just made things next to impossible. The electric boot heaters also were a concern if they were right on the unit. However, when you're doing a search, I don't think there's enough interference that we should be worried about our boots if you have the electric heater on, because by the time you're close enough that you're getting down close to the snow, the signal is so strong and the interference is relatively low, it's not that bad. You're probably not going to have a distinct issue. So those were kind of hopeful things. Cameras did have an issue. Both the Nikon and the Olympus, when their displays were on, did create interference but again, only when they were very close to the transceiver on receive. Surprisingly though, when we use the autofocus, the motors on the autofocus, those would dramatically impact the units, even at 30 centimeters. But because the autofocus is so fast, it was just a short blip and then everything went back to normal. So we couldn't really measure that because we couldn't run the motors for any long period of time. But the autofocus motors on cameras might actually be an issue. GPS units, they weren't profound, but yeah, again, it's probably the electric screen. Without the screen on, the GPS units had no impact. With the screen, with the screens off, there was no significant impact. With the screens on, up close, they were a problem. We tried a VHF radio. I had a 5-watt ICOM, both on transmit and on receive. And yes, right on top of the unit, it did have an impact. But at distance, it was very little. And again, Ivers was confident that the frequencies are not overlapping. They're not causing issues. It's just the tiny little LCD display screen on them. And so they were not a significant issue. If you're holding your transceiver in one hand and your radio in the other and you're making a call, it's probably not having a significant impact. So those were all pretty hopeful things that we found. There are issues. They're primarily screens, motors, and LED lights. The Wi-Fi setting and the Bluetooth setting on the iPhone really didn't have a significant impact. It was the screen. So those were all really significant. When we moved over and we looked at the same thing using the PEEPS DS, which is a bit of a simpler model. It wasn't as solid as the Barryvox, but still it was not a significant difference. So that was a good sign. And then we tried doing a search because we figured, okay, so suppose you do have a level of interference, you can't figure it out and you've got to look for somebody. How are you going to do this? The first thing we discovered is going with a 40-meter strip search created far too much uncertainty and we could miss the target. You might lose the signal and never find the person. But when we squeezed it down to a 20-meter strip search, we could always pick up a signal when we were doing our zigzags. And here's an example where we got a clean search. So this is Ivers, he's walking, he's got the PEEPS, and we've got 3 units, basically a VHS radio, GPS, LED light, and we might even have the LED or the tablet on there as well. And we picked up a signal doing a 20-meter strip search, walked straight in, no problem. This happened fairly often. So if you just do a tighter strip search, you can actually have pretty good success, but not 100%. We did find some variations. So we put, oh yeah, I put in a little more interference here. I've got a tablet right beside the unit as well. The LED light is going, the VHF radio is on receive, and a GPS unit with its screen on. So those things combined produced enough interference that the signal was not picked up immediately as we got close. But it did get picked up.
That wasn't good.
There. So we got the signal acquired. When you acquire a signal and you suspect there's interference, physically mark that location because the arrows were not working properly and they actually took us out into the wrong area. But if you mark the area and then instead of just following the line, if the line takes you in the wrong direction, come back to your marked location and grid it. Most likely the signal is below you. So start going down. Don't trust the arrows on your transceiver, but follow the numbers. As the numbers get larger, just like we would search with the old analog units, it works. They get larger and larger. And we found once we got within 15 meters of the victim, then basically following just a standard induction search worked beautifully. But when we first picked up the signal, we had to mark that spot because sometimes we would be sent in the wrong direction because of the interference. We came back to that spot and then we basically started a grid search strictly using the numbers. Watch the numbers. As they get smaller, you're getting a stronger signal. And once we saw numbers less than 15, we could continue with a standard search and find the victim. Okay, so Did we look at the type of batteries being used? No, we just used pretty much standard alkaline, and I'm buying actually the low grade stuff over at some of the no-name batteries, but they are alkaline and they were fresh. Okay, we did not look at multiple burials, but I think if you move down to within the 20-meter strip search, you're probably going to have a fairly efficient way to basically pick up at least which one is closest. Oh, batteries in the interfering units. Some of them were within the interfering units. Some of the batteries were alkaline, some of them were rechargeable, so lithium ion, the various sources. So no, we didn't look at those specifically. We looked at the interference of the combined. So no, we didn't look at the batteries. Okay. Okay, so then we wanted to look at the situation. What if the transmitting unit is polluted? The victim is buried and they may have interference very close to them. And this was actually kind of a good news story. We could not overwhelm the transmitting signal using things like radios, tablets, GPS, phones with their screens on. None of these things were enough to impede a search from the point of the transmitter having interference. The only thing that could really overwhelm the transmitter was, again, the cordless drill almost in contact with the transmitter running. And so that's a very powerful source of interference. And that was the only thing that successfully overwhelmed the transmitter. That didn't stop us from being able to complete a search though. What we did is we found that if instead of doing a full search, if we went to a 5-meter micro strip search, so we basically did 5 meters across, then 5 meters down, we just keep going down 5 meters at a time, we could get a signal, even with a heavily polluted transmitter. The arrows did not work at all, but the numbers did. So once we picked up an initial signal, and it was about 6 meters away from the unit, by following the numbers and just keep grid searching to bring in the smallest numbers we could find, it did put us essentially right on top of the transmitter. However, the numbers were not accurate. I was standing about 1.5 meters over the transmitter where I got my strongest number, and yet it kept reading 4 meters or greater. So it's not exact. But if you did have a situation where you had somebody buried in an industrial setting with an electric motor that was still running, or another major source of interference, this might allow you to look at a situation and then look at the most likely burial sites and basically do microstrip search. When you get that signal, just keep grid searching it to your smallest number, mark the spot and probe it out. You're not going to have any indication on their actual depth, and you could be off because there was a lot of interference, but you're close enough that you probably still have a reasonable chance for, maybe a live recovery, because you can isolate your search area very quickly. Okay, so that's basically what we found. And overall, we felt pretty good about this because the situation is a lot simpler than we thought. So long as we avoid LCD screens close to the unit and we kept running electric motors away from them, they worked pretty well. And once we got units more than 30 centimeters, there really wasn't much of an issue. Then, I think I have this here. Yeah, we looked at some of the anomalies. One of the things we found is if you take foil and you wrap your transceiver like a baked potato, you basically destroyed your transmitter. It will work, sort of, kind of. The range is a lot shorter and your signal is not clean. So this might have future implications if we start seeing basically foil lined jackets, or some of the electrically heated jackets might start causing this issue. But that's a pretty extreme situation for the transmitter. And we keep hearing these stories about foiled wrappers right beside the transmitter affecting the signal. So I tried this. Ivers was busy, And I got out one day and just put a transmitter down and then did a search for them, both parallel and perpendicular antennas. And what I found is when the antennas were parallel, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner how I placed the foil over the unit. So I had 3 bars, one of them going directly over top of the transmitter. When the antennas were parallel, there was some difference, but it was still very small when you look at the transceiver perpendicular. From a clean to the wrapper signal was almost nothing. And when I did the actual search, I walked in beautifully. It was very clean. So I could not find an issue. However, we did find if you have foil, say you put foil on your hand, or you had a glove that had some of those foil linings to help reflect the heat back into your hand, and you put a transceiver or a receiver on top of that, that did effectively greatly reduce their effectiveness. So again, foil lined gloves, electrically powered gloves can really mess you up. But if you're just have a granola bar or something beside your transceiver, we did not see a significant difference, certainly not meaningful. I tried the same thing also with airbags. The electric airbags, again, Ivers wasn't available, but I was a guide in town who generously donated a bag for a couple of days. And I put the avalanche airbag directly on top of the transceiver. And I put the electric motor directly above the transceiver, turned it on, ran away, and measured basically the signal at 20 and at 40 meters. And the difference between having the motor running, which should produce a lot of interference, and nothing was essentially 0. I found a difference of less than 1 meter in terms of their sensitivity range. So it looks like the manufacturers have addressed the electromagnetic interference in the electric motors. And perhaps the reason we're seeing some airbags affect transceivers is because the motors may be damaged or the shielding around them may be damaged, and that is causing a problem. But overall, the black diamond bag we tested produced no significant interference at all. And that, in a nutshell, is what we found. So yeah, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But effectively, yeah, this just seems a lot easier because when you're teaching students and you're going through this, I can't tell you how many different stories I've heard about what will interfere with the transceiver and what we need to be doing. For the most part, it's pretty simple and straightforward. Plus, we can do effective searches. This is just the beginning. It would be nice to see a more detailed study on how to do a search. But both Ivers and myself felt pretty good that just bringing the grid search in tighter and marking when you get a signal, your initial signal, went a long way to still being able to find people.
Thanks, Doug. I think we have some questions for you from the floor.
Sure. There's one here on what about the electric airbags affecting searching transceivers? We did not test searching transceivers because the motors shut themselves off. And I would assume that you would not pull your airbag unless you were caught in the avalanche. So we didn't test with the receiving units, just the transmitter. Okay. Was I always using the tracker 2 as the transmitting beacon for the initial tests? Yes. And we did take care to make sure we aligned the antennas properly because it's in the X pattern, not on right angles. Okay, sorry.
Doug, I really appreciate that. It's a great study and good to bring some evidence-based information to the discussions about interference. I really appreciate it. My question is, our current guidance for using a communications device like a cell phone to communicate with the outside world is to step away 25 meters from the search.
Right.
Is that still good guidance?
Okay, it's not my place to decide what the criteria would be, but what we found is the cell phone, it's the screen. It's not the frequency that's the issue. And Ivers was pretty comfortable saying that. So, you know, stick to the industry best practices. If you're in a situation where you've just got to make a call because you're doing a search and you're also the one who's going to have to call for help, I probably wouldn't hesitate so long as my unit, so long as I've got that signal and the 2 units are spread out, you know, more than arm's length. I don't think you're going to cause anything irreparable
Doug, the interference you were getting with the electric gloves, was that with them turned off as well?
No, we weren't seeing that issue with them turned off. But what we couldn't do is take the gloves apart and see just how much metal was running through the glove itself, because we did find that foil significantly degraded both receivers and transmitters. Although with transmitters, they had to be fully wrapped before it was a major issue.
Hey, Doug. I was just wondering if you did any testing on the magnetic goggles and that type of thing. Seems to me like the the electric motor has such an impact because of the electromagnetic field caused by the induction motor. I wonder if the magnets in the goggles would be some sort of similar interference.
We didn't see a significant problem with the electric motor when it was turned off. And I believe they would have some hard magnets in them. So magnetic goggles, and this is just supposition, we did not test them. So long as they're away from the transceiver, probably aren't a major concern. What might be a bigger problem in my mind is if you have polarized lenses, all the LCD screens, basically you can't see them, so you have to take them off anyways.
Questions from online?
Oh, okay. Any insight on Fitbits or GPS watches and interference? GPS was not a significant factor for us once the screens were off. So I wouldn't put it in direct contact with the receiving unit, but more than 30 centimeters away, they were a non-issue. The Fitbits, again, it's probably the screen because the frequency is quite a bit different than what we're searching for with the transceivers. We did not test them. I can't say that with certainty, but that would be my suspicion.
Hey, Doug, thanks a lot for that. Just a comment, teaching a lot of SLEDR AST courses. I found actually that we could pretty effectively do a search over a large debris field, driving slowly on the snow machine. And also it didn't seem to impact a search if there was an idling snow machine in close proximity to the searcher.
Okay.
But definitely warrants some further research, I think, for sure.
Absolutely. And we didn't have a snowmobile to actually test doing this. We're in a national park and neither of us own one. But what we were just extrapolating, the snowmobiles have to generate electricity to for some of their components. And what they use is the magneto, which is very similar and has moving magnets to an electric motor. And so it was a supposition. I don't know how significant it is, but it would be sort of in the back of my brain if, you know, I was involved with the rescue and snowmobiles were involved or coming in to assist. But that's good to know. Thank you.
Any other questions out there? Okay, thanks very much, Doug. That was really relevant and timely information. I know people have had a lot of questions about this stuff for a while, so thanks for clarifying, and something to keep an eye on, but it doesn't seem quite as dire as maybe we thought. So look forward to continued research from you as well.
It's a starting point. Hopefully, you know, people will take the time to, especially I find with the searching tip practice, there's some good opportunities for us to figure out how to be able to search, even if we think there is interference, I think. So thanks very much.
Thank you.